This is Hollisa and the Creation Gospel. Welcome back to our series entitled The Spirit-Filled Family. In this series, we're going to look at different parts of the family. We're going to look at husbands, look at wives, children, and even those spirit-filled singles. That's also a stage of family growth. So, in the last program, we looked at a verse in Exodus 21:10 that pretty much establishes the basic obligations in a marriage of a husband toward his wife. And in the last couple of programs, what we've been unpacking is that what seems to be merely a physical commandment in terms of food, clothing, and conjugal rights, as we unpack those Hebrew words, we realize that they mean something much deeper than what we see at the physical level. And that's what it says. Exodus 21:10, it says, "He may not reduce her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights." So in the previous programs, we looked pretty carefully at the food, the she'erah. Then we looked at the kesutah, which is the clothing. And we peeled down until we found actually the spiritual impact of keeping this commandment. And we realized it was much deeper than just putting food on the table and clothes on the back. And that's what we're finding out now, because we're looking at that third requirement, which is translated in English as conjugal rights. And what we saw in its use is that it doesn't just refer to that duty of marriage in terms of marital relations, that it also has to do with a time period. And it can mean two different kinds of time periods. It can mean that time period when you are cohabiting with your spouse, or it can mean, it's like an equivalent expression to a time of nidah, or a period of separation during menstruation. And so you have to kind of look at the context of the word and its use to know whether it's referring to this time or that time. But for our purposes, we're going to look at the onah as that time of holy intimacy between a husband and wife, when they separate basically from the world and the two become one flesh in that holy union. Now, even though that commandment is telling a husband to provide nourishment to his wife and coverings for his wife, it also commands him to provide that time of intimacy with his wife, the onah. We can see as this commandment develops, like so many other commandments in the Torah, what we realize is often these commandments are very terse, very economical in their delivery in terms of the words that are used. But as the scripture unfolds, we see how it was applied in a practical way by Israel. And so we can understand that sometimes commandments that seem to apply only to men, as they are applied in the living, in the prophets, and in the Brit Chadashah even, is that commandment, the enactment of it will also extend to the female, or it might extend to the entire family. In terms of keeping the Passover, the whole family might go up, not just the males, but at a minimum, the commandment required the males to appear. That did not preclude, obviously, the women and the children, the entire family from going up, and that seems to be the practice. If you were able to go, you went. That was part of it. So, as we go into the Brit Chadashah, the New Testament, we can see even more instructions. We can see more specific instructions concerning the very terse Exodus 21:10, where just very briefly we're given a piece of information, but then we realize, well, if we just unpack 3 Hebrew words from that one verse, we can see how deep that commandment is. But with a casual reading, just at the Peshat level, we're not really going to apprehend how deep that commandment is. As we get over into the Brit Chadashah, what we realize is that, yes, these commandments are indeed deeper than just the surface value. Because in terms of the ona, which is that time of physical intimacy between a husband and a wife, we're commanded there that we should not abstain from that time unless it's with mutual consent. In other words, the ona is a critical relationship building time between a husband and wife. And that was the point of spending so much time in the previous programs looking at the food, the she'erah, and the clothing, the kesuta, because we realized what was happening there was of mutual benefit. There was a reciprocal sort of relationship in place when the husband rendered the she'erah and the kesuta, that he was actually giving her his own flesh, revealing his own inner flesh, which is going to be reciprocated because it's a dialogue, it's a conversation, it's a going back and forth so that we begin to understand the deepest parts of the other person. In the same way with the covering, we saw in the hitpa'el verb form of the clothing, it means to clothe yourself. So whatever coverings you provide for this other person, you're actually covering yourself at the same time. Now, in terms of the ona, the husband is told that he may not reduce that time that is due to his wife. And there again, in the scriptures, sometimes things flip according to the way that we think about them in our culture. We come out of a culture sometimes where it's considered a wife's obligation. But in the Torah, it's the husband's obligation to give her that time that she asks for. And so the assumption there is that it's going to be with mutual consent and mutual benefit. In other words, it's not just for the good of one or the other. Just like the food and the clothing, this time of conjugal relations, by virtue of what it is in context, it has to be something that is mutually desired and beneficial. So there's a mutual consent. And that's why in the Brit Chadashah, we are told not to engage that or disengage from it without mutual consent. We cannot unilaterally decide to withdraw from that part of our relationship because those three things, the food, the clothing, and the conjugal rights, they are so critical to a relationship that reducing them could have a negative impact on the marriage and what the marriage was even meant to do in the world with that particular couple. Adonai did not put you together as a couple in such a random way for it to be unimportant how you move forward as a couple, because he put you together to share those dreams, to share those divinely assigned gifts, and he has put a purpose in your marriage that goes beyond just raising children, retiring from work, and then playing shuffleboard on a cruise ship. The plans that he has for you are good plans, and they're fruitful plans. And if you will follow the plan, it says that you will be fruitful, even more fruitful in your old age. That's what I'm looking forward to. But in order to do that, we cannot distance ourselves from these three foundational things in a marriage. We cannot withhold food, we cannot withhold coverings, and we cannot withhold the ona, which means we cannot hold a deep relationship with the other. We can never become casual in our relationship with our spouse. That's unacceptable, and it's actually a violation or a transgression of the commandment. A coldness in marriage is not acceptable because the relationship is built on these three stones. It's built on the food, each of you revealing your inner flesh to the other, giving that trust. It's built on coverings. For the woman, being covered and concealed under the spiritual authority of her husband, and reciprocally, that he is entrusting her with that mission, basically that blank check that we talked about understanding that because she is a valorous woman, that he can trust her, and he feels very safe handing her his signature in order to do whatever the Spirit leads her to do to bring good to his household and to build his name. He does not see it as a competition when she's building her own reputation by good deeds, because he feels that those deeds reflect on him, that he doesn't have to compete with them. You never want to see a husband and a wife in a competition when they were meant to share the reputation of their good deeds. And this is how the kingdom is advanced. It brings glory to the name of the Holy One when they work together, but it brings dishonor on the name of the Holy One when they get into a competition, and what the world sees in them is the discord that grows out of becoming competitive with one another. And that can enter in very subtly in a number of ways. It might enter in relation to how you deal with disciplining children. It may enter in jobs, in terms of your choice of jobs or how much time you're devoting to a job. It may come in terms of relationships outside the family. There might be friendships that a spouse does not entirely approve of, and all of a sudden that spouse feels himself or herself in a competition with those friends. And because the trust is not there, then they resent the time that you spend with those friends. They see it as a competition. They don't see it as something necessary for you as a human being to have that fellowship, to have friends outside the home. And then they resent giving you that freedom. And then it begins to work back and forth. And what may start as a hairline fracture eventually becomes a huge break that's very difficult to bridge. So understand that it's more than just a physical thing. Your conjugal relations need to be characterized by something much more than what goes on in the physical realm. It needs to be a time when you can actually fulfill those other parts of that verse that talk about revealing your inner self. It's not just about completing the conjugal relations in terms of physical action. It's about knowing the other person and experiencing the other person in the process, truly becoming one. And so we're talking about probably there being dialogue. That's very important, because we're not beasts. We're not animals. We're not simply there for the physical aspect. We're there to build the marriage. And that's going to make it a very holy time, a very holy ona. And that ona is critical for relationship building if we do it in that way. If we're doing it in a different way, it's really not an ona. It's really not what is commanded. It's really nothing more than the same thing a beast would do. And we are not made in the image of the beast. We are made in the image of Elohim. And with Elohim, relationships are about dialogue. It's about knowing one another. That's the type of intimacy on a spiritual level. So it goes beyond simply the physical, which lives in the land of the beast, but it extends into heavenly realms in terms of the spiritual. It goes beyond for a man just earning income and putting food on the table and clothes on the back. It goes beyond just simply completing an act that a beast could do. It means truly rendering yourself to your spouse. It means that you know her in every sense of the word. It's not just a physical thing. It's truly knowing her. In the same way that you reveal yourself to her, you will come to know her. And there's another scripture that tells us why this is true. We'll look at that scripture as well. Because it's going to be difficult for men to engage these ideas. It's more difficult for them, typically, not 100%, because some men do operate at a much higher spiritual level than women. So we're not saying this is true across the board. We're saying these are characteristics. That's why they've got books out there called Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. There's a recognition that we are wired typically differently. So the ona is the duty of the husband to his wife, not the reverse. However, when we move into the Brit Chadashah, women are cautioned, just like the men, equally, that they are not to withhold from their husbands. Because remember, this is one of those foundational things of how couples establish that spiritual depth in their marriage. Now, is there a time to withdraw? He says for prayer and fasting. Yes, but don't unilaterally decide to do that because you want to be more holy or whatever. See, if you simply do that, if you just say, hey, I'm withdrawing from this because I need to fast and pray, well, that right there tells you that the dialogue was never opened with the other person. You don't dictate that this is what I'm going to do. You open the conversation and say, this is what I feel like the Spirit wants me to do right now at this point in my life. I feel like I really need to fast and pray for this specific period. And I think I would also like to fast from this activity as well. Is that acceptable to you? How do you feel about this? Do you think this will help? Do you agree to this? And see, that draws the other person not just into the conversation, but into the unity of the spiritual vision of what you're trying to accomplish with this fasting and praying. But in terms of punishing the other or trying to take control or power over the other by using food, clothing, or conjugal rights, that is unacceptable, and that is a transgression of this commandment. It cannot be done unilaterally. The Brit Chadashah is telling you this. It's giving you this pattern. So whether you're a husband or whether you're a wife, you are prohibited from withdrawing anything like that without the consent of the wife, without the consent of the other. I mean, let's put it back even on a physical level. Let's say you're married and at some point you think, well, I think I would like to go back to school. I'd like to go back to college and finish my degree. Which is the proper way, according to the commandment, to walk in one day and say, I'm quitting my job. You'll have to get a job and you're going to have to come up with some tuition money for me. Or, according to the Torah, would the proper way to approach that be to walk in and say, you know, I've prayed about this, and I really think that I should go back to school and finish my degree. Let's talk about the problems this would create and how you feel about it. And rather than pressuring an answer at the moment, instead, open the dialogue. Here's why I think I should go back to college. I really believe that the Father's plan for me is to be this or to do this. And in order to accomplish this goal, I'm going to need these skills or I'm going to need this academic background. But that's the vision that I have. Can you share with me how you see that happening? And how we could get together on this and we could actually make it happen? Do you see the difference in the two? One way is the way a beast does it. And the other way is the way that it's engaged with the Spirit, and actually with the spirit of the commandment, with the spirit of the Torah, not the letter of the Torah, which would be a violation either way if you were to withhold. Now, if she comes into agreement and says, you know what, I'll get a job, we'll look at some grants, let's put our heads together and see what we need to do to put this in place. At that point, you have mutual agreement that this is the path we're going to take. There might be some details to work out, but you have consent, just like the Brit Chadashah is telling you. You didn't unilaterally decide this is what you're going to do. You came into agreement as one that this is the vision, and here's how we're going to try to bring it about. Mutual consent. In any of these areas, if you're jeopardizing the relationship with unilateral decisions, you're making huge mistakes. And that's just, as they say, the bottom line. If you're in a marriage, unilaterally making and imposing decisions, you're in a state of transgression against the Torah. If that other person is functional and they're walking in faith, there's no reason to circumvent the path that the Scripture itself has set out. These are foundational things in the Torah. They're plainly there. And so that mutual spiritual application is more difficult. Trust me, it's much harder if you feel that you have the power to impose your will on others. It's much harder to go in there and to solicit agreement and dialogue. But the level of the Spirit requires that. You go deeper and you consider the needs of the other. Remember that spirit of reverence? The Spirit of Adonai is foundational to everything, because it says the reverence of Adonai is the beginning of all wisdom. If you're trying to approach a problem with wisdom, then it's going to have to start with reverence, not just for the Father in heaven, but with the people with whom you're engaging the problem. Now, in its first appearance in the Torah, the obligation for a husband to meet his wife's needs in a physical way is explained using a word, remember, that means to dwell together. That's the meaning of the onah. So what it's telling you, that it's not a one-time thing, or it's not a thing that's quickly done. It's actually the result of living or dwelling with your wife. In other words, the onah is actually a relationship that is built in time, and it's built with time. You know, there used to be a saying, I guess, when parents felt guilty about having latchkey kids because both parents were working or whatever, and they would say, well, it's not quantity time, it's quality time. But the truth is, both are needed. If a husband gives his wife not just quality time, but quantity time, and not just quantity time, but quality time, then he is actually fulfilling the commandment. Because to give her the onah is going to extend beyond just that act of cohabitation. You cannot build the relationship simply with that. It's not enough time. The time consists of being together and dwelling together, it says. To have that physical time with her. Now, it doesn't mean that that's going to monopolize all your spare time. That's not what it means. But it means that you cannot reduce that which is necessary to build that relationship. And for some people, it might be different than others. Some couples might need more time. Whether it's alone time at the house, or going out somewhere together, date night, whatever it takes. Others, they're not going to need as much time. As the relationship ages, sometimes it's different according to the actual personality of the marriage. But you as a couple will find that ideal dwelling together in terms of the time that's needed to fulfill this commandment toward one another. Because it follows, if the husband is required to give the time for dwelling with his wife, then she in turn is also obligated. That's why we say it's by mutual consent, whether we come together, and it's by mutual consent that we separate from one another or abstain. Not separate in terms of separate from the marriage, but in terms of that part of the relationship, the onah itself. So her set apart time is her holy time. Her onah is a holy time, actually to both of you, not just her. But she is entitled to you for a certain amount of time, and that time is holy. And you cannot diminish that time. And you say, well, what about when the kids come along? That seems like all we do is put on diapers and do bottles and this sort of stuff and run to Walmart and all that. Hey, it says you may not diminish her time except by agreement. She may agree for certain periods in your life that we can't spend as much time together as we used to, but we're still going to work very hard to create those spaces of time so that we can be together for that, to reveal that inner flesh. Because with the, especially when kids come along, hormones can really affect the way a mother feels, and she may actually need more time. She may need more ona, not necessarily for the conjugal relations, but in terms of dwelling with her, to listen to her, because she may have some fears. She may have thoughts that she doesn't know how to deal with that are really, it's just a result of her physical condition at that time in terms of the changes within her body. And she's going to need more of an ear and more encouragement during that time. At a time when it seems like it's the hardest to do it, she might need it the most. So you as a husband, if you have invested that time in your relationship, you should be able to read that and know, she needs me more now than ever. And I need to make sure that I'm listening to her at this time. She needs my ear. But that's a holy thing, time. Just like Shabbat. It's the first thing called holy, but it's really a space of time. In terms of your wife, it's the same thing. The Ona is holy to her. It's holy to you. But it's like an intangible because it's time. It's a set-apart time. It's like a Shabbat. The same way that Shabbat charges us and really crowns our week, in the same way that time of the Ona, no matter how you're spending that time, that's the crown of your time together. That is the time when intimacy increases, because it's basically you two against the world. Well, see, on Shabbat, that space of time, we're carving out this space of time for the Holy One of Israel. And if necessary, it's us against the world, because we're doing something that goes counter maybe to what the rest of the world does. And so that's where you have the opportunity to see yourselves as a team working together. We'll look more into this after the break. Hello, this is Dr. Hollisa Elwine. I hope you'll check out all my workbooks at the Hebraic Roots Network shop. All of the proceeds from the workbooks, from our Creation Gospel products, they go toward missions, toward Torah-based missions in Africa and India. This is very important to us, that the Torah reach the nations, and you can be part of that when you purchase our products. I know that you can benefit from the products, but more importantly, you can be part of sending that Torah forth to the nations. Welcome back. So we're talking about carving out a space of time, a space of holiness like Shabbat, that we call the Ona, a time when the intimacy is the focus. And therefore, it's a time of holiness, because remember, the definition of holiness is to be set apart in order to be gathered eventually to like kind and like mind. All right? In holiness, we're set apart from the world, kind of like the Shabbat, and it becomes a time of holiness between husband and wife. And they are gathered together as like kind and like mind. We call that element of holiness within the Ona, we call that Kiddushin. It comes from Kadosh, which means holy. And if we look back at the pattern, often in Scripture, it is things that are holy. For instance, in the tabernacle, it was objects that were considered holy. It might have been the altar was holy, or the utensils were holy, or the ark itself was holy. And even certain spaces were holier than others. They were more set apart than others. And it seemed like the farther that you went in toward the Holy of Holies, the fewer and fewer people who were actually qualified to move into that holy space. So there's holy objects, And there's holy spaces. With a husband and wife, though, there is a holy time, just like Shabbat. And when he spreads over his wife that covering, that kesutah, the clothing, his inner flesh, all this becomes holy in the Yonah. It's no longer just food he provides. It's no longer just the coverings of clothes that he provides, but he is making that space for her of holiness, and he is to guard that space. The same way that the space in the garden needed to be guarded. Well, Adam didn't do such a good job of protecting the boundaries. And there was an encroachment. Somebody encroached upon the holiness of that relationship. And so a marriage, we can see it's more than food, it's more than clothes, it's more than sex, it's a relationship. It's a relationship that's built not just at a physical level, but at a spiritual level that's going to bond together their nafshim, their souls. A husband is to use that natural physical strength and that authority that he has in his household to protect his wife's modesty in all things physical and spiritual. And in terms of looking at these three requirements, we can see why they're so foundational when we peel back and look what is beyond the physical within the commandments. Now, these are so important, again, that as we go into the Brit Chadashah, we can see that the Torah is not left behind, but we get even more information about how we should view these words of the Torah or apply the words of the Torah. In 1 Timothy 5:8, Paul is giving Timothy instruction on really how to apply Exodus 21:10, the three irreducible obligations of a husband. They are so important, like we said in Jewish law, that they form the foundation of Jewish law. In his letter, Paul says, if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Wow, that's a pretty strong statement. If there is an able-bodied man out there with a family, then he is not to disregard these commandments of the Torah. Instead, Paul goes a step farther than just saying, you need to do this, or you may not do this. He's saying, if you don't provide for your own household, he says, especially for those of his household, in other words, those closest to him, those in his holy spaces, then he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. All right? What if we take that to the actual depth of the Hebrew words that we studied with the she'erah, the kesutah, and the onah, understanding it's way deeper than what's on the physical level. That it's actually a very deep relationship in the spirit realm. If we apply that same statement that Paul is making to Timothy, it may be that not fulfilling those things is not just a transgression in the physical realm, that I didn't provide food, clothing, and or conjugal rights to my household, to my wife, but even more, he's calling me like an unbeliever. In fact, worse than an unbeliever. Because below that is the fact that not only did I fail at the very simple level, I have failed at a spiritual level. I have failed to obey these commandments as they were written to me, which is that it's more than just food on the table and clothes on the back. Now, Paul says that's if you don't do it at all. Let's say, just for the sake of argument, which I don't want to start any arguments, but just for let's say a thought question. What if we were to keep the letter of the Torah? What if, let's say, a man would provide for his household physical food, they have plenty to eat, clothing, they have plenty of clothes to wear, and there is cohabitation. with his wife. But it's all taking place simply at a physical level. The relationships within the household are not deepened by the fact that he provides food for the household. The relationship is not deepened by how he covers his household. Neither is the relationship with his wife deepened when he cohabits with her. It's simply checking off the boxes, if you will, which is what we would call keeping the letter of the Torah, but disregarding the spirit of the Torah that underpins it. In fact, is the first cause to any act of creation or obedience, or it should be. Is keeping only the letter of the Torah without the movement of the Spirit. Do you think that would be the equivalent of, say, Torahlessness? Because let's think of a statement Yeshua made. He said, there will be people who come and they're going to say, you know, we cast out demons in your name, we healed the sick, we did these wonderful things in your name. And he's going to say, depart from me, I never knew you. In fact, he calls them workers of iniquity. I never knew you. In other words, when he's using the Hebrew word yada, it goes back to the spirit of da'at, that sixth spirit, which is the spirit of knowledge. But remember, knowledge is not just information in the Hebrew context. It's deep knowing. It's sacrificial love. It's two becoming one, becoming two, becoming one, becoming two, becoming one. There's a real unity there because flesh and bone have been sacrificed. That's what Adam said when he saw his wife. He said, flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone. Not only has it cost me flesh and bone for this relationship with my wife, she is my flesh and bone. And that's difficult in a marriage to see that other person as our flesh and bone because they're so different from us. But we need to be able to look at one another and smile and say, flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone, you're that other half of me. Without you, I am incomplete. So Yeshua was saying there's going to be people who go through motions, outward motions. Nevertheless, they never knew him in a sacrificial way. In other words, that intimacy of relationship was never established with him. They were checking off the boxes maybe. But that spiritual level of things that we've been talking about, the Ruach Da'at, the spirit of knowledge, it was not present in that performance of the mitzvot. It just wasn't there. So let's move that over and apply it to these three obligations of a husband. Can he go through the motions? Can he put the food on the table? Can he put the clothes on the back? Can he cohabit with his wife? And at the end of days, when the judgments are made, is it possible it could be ruled that he never knew her and he never knew the commandment because he never sacrificed himself for it? That's just a thought question. It's something to think about, not just in relation of a husband to a wife, but for every one of us in our relation to the commandments. Do we move beyond simply the fulfillment of the physical commandment, and do we look for those opportunities to deepen and widen our relationships with other people, understanding that it's going to be sacrificial, that I'm going to have to give my faith away. Instead of just believing and having faith, I'm actually going to have to complete a transaction with someone, trust the Holy One, and extend my faith to that person to complete the transaction. That understanding that the things I do, they can't simply be at a physical level by rote, not if we want those to be acceptable sacrifices. Understand that we can take any commandment that way. let's say, almost anything we can do in the course of the day, we can simply do it at a physical level and get it done. Or we can elevate it to the level of the spiritual. Just like with this commandment. We can simply check off the box and do the commandment, or I can elevate it according to the spirit of the commandment. How about a family meal? Right? Can a family have drive through Mickey D's, get a burger and fries and a soft drink, eat on the way home, be distracted with video games, text messages, driving, and so forth? Never have a conversation over the meal. Never say, how was your week? Or how was your day today? Do you have homework tonight? Do you need help with your homework? How was work, mom or dad? How was work, honey? Instead of asking the questions that can draw us closer in relationship, do we simply do the fast food thing? So is putting that food on the table just physical? Or as a parent, can we elevate that meal to the level of the spiritual and ensure that, at least for the most part, our family meals are something where we share one another, that we share our inner flesh with one another, that we truly find out and elevate that family meal to a level of holiness, to something that we are set apart from how the rest of the world does this in order to be gathered to like kind and like mind. And then when we can do that, then we're engaging it more at a spiritual level, that we're deepening, broadening our relationships within the family. Eating on the run can be done, but it's probably going to be engaged at a carnal level. But as a family, if you sit down together to eat, and it may be that you pick up something to eat and take it home, rather than just cramming it into your mouth, that you actually sit there and use that set-apart time, just like an onah, being a set-apart time, that you use that time, that you don't take it for granted, that you don't miss it, that there's actually an opportunity there that's not missed, so that we can go and run after our own interests, but instead sit and share that family meal. That's going to elevate it to the realm of the spiritual. Right? What about discussing a word of Torah at every meal? Yeah, well, that's traditional, at least on Shabbat, but what if you could do it once a day at a meal? What if you could discuss a word of Torah with your kids? Or you know what, better yet, let the kids discuss it. Let them have a topic and let them say a few words about a passage from the scripture. Maybe take a proverb each day. Assign a proverb. Say, what does this mean? I want you to explain to me what this means at the next meal. You can assign these things. You put kids on a schedule. You know, if you've got more than one kid, they're going to give answers according to their understanding, but you might start some really neat conversations at the table that would elevate it from simply putting the food on the table and in our mouths to the level of the spiritual, to where you're sowing not just physical food into that child, but spiritual bread. Just like Yeshua said, did you think I was talking about bread? No, he's talking about the Spirit. The same thing with us. At every opportunity we can to sow spiritual bread into our children. But in order to do that, it's going to take an investment of time. It takes an onah. So you can see how these three irreducible obligations of the husband, it extends even beyond the husband and wife relationship into the level of the children or the extended family. The same concepts, the same foundational principles of those three things, those can also be extended to the family. Now, obviously, the cohabitation part of the onah cannot be extended, but the concept of time and the holiness of time, that can be extended to other family members. And how will that look? It means I give more time to my kids, whether it's quantity or quality, hopefully both. But I can be available. You know what? I can let my kids know something about me and about my growth in the Spirit. I can navigate parts of my life to them as they are able to grasp it. You know, your kids might be surprised to find out that when Dad was 18, that, I don't know, he drove a Corvette. They may not see Dad that way. But by sharing some of these things, by sharing a word of Torah, by covering them, by making sure those clothes are on the back. And see, in terms of covering, you can extend that too. It's not just physical protection for your children, but they can begin to learn to work under your authority as a husband or under their mother's authority. And they might say, okay, here's what we need done. You have this much time to complete it, but I'm going to let you decide how it gets done. You know, and that's going to go back to that Bina building with children that we study in the children's section, giving them the ability to make more and more responsible decisions. Well, part of that is when we let them make those decisions, we're kind of giving them a covering of authority and saying, whatever you're going to do, you're doing it basically under my say-so and my protection. So I'm going to give you everything you need to complete this task, but I'm going to leave it up to you how to do it. And that gives them that covering, just like a husband does for his wife, that blank check. Whatever you need to do to bring good to this household, I trust you. The same thing with the kids. You know how kids love to hear that their parents trust them? And when that becomes really important to a child, one of the worst things that can happen to that child is to find out that, you know what, I don't think my parents trust me anymore. When they make those big mistakes, that seems to be the worst fear that they can voice. It's not the consequences. It might not be that I'm going to get grounded or I won't be able to drive for the next month. For those kids who have that soft heart like that, what's really killing them inside is, I don't think Mom and Dad trust me anymore because of this mistake. And so they need that covering. They need that reassurance sometimes that, yes, you make mistakes and you're going to have to bear consequences. That's part of the process. But that doesn't mean we remove our covering from you. All right? So a lot of times clothing can be physical expressions of just a very gentle and quiet spirit. It doesn't have to be loud. Remember, you know, when we first read the foundational verse from Peter, it talked about how for women at least, we shouldn't depend upon outer clothing or jewelry, but we should cultivate a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great value to the Father in heaven. Well, we can do that for our children too. We can maintain that gentle and quiet spirit with them and give them coverings of clothes. We can teach them even how to clothe themselves with a gentle and quiet spirit. But it depends upon spending that quality time, that onah, that holiness of time with them in order to transfer these things from us to them. And that's where, at least foundationally, as we develop this as a husband and wife, then we have something to even pass on to the children. It first has to be cultivated in that relationship, or it's going to be really difficult to pass on to the children the same qualities. And what we're looking for is not just the physical, but the same spiritual qualities where they will never cease to look beyond just the physical commandment. There's nothing more beautiful than hearing a child verbalize that he understands that the commandment is spiritual, and to perceive things and the spirit underlying it. And that's just it. Proverbs are great things for kids to use. Not only are they practical, but they are actually parables of the Holy Spirit. So they're getting more than they think they're getting when they study or when they memorize or when they read the book of Proverbs. They're actually receiving parables of the Holy Spirit that seem to just be practical advice. It's a wonderful tool to extend not just to the wife, but to the entire family, these three qualities that Exodus 21:10 is talking about. So, time is important. Again, that time of dwelling together, that quality time, but with a husband and wife, also the kiddushin, that very holy time, the time of the onah, the time of the physical union. And what we have to remember is, just like the Brit Chadashah teaches, when we enter into those times or when we disengage from those times, it has to be with mutual consent, because what would follow is that there is mutual benefit. And you cannot take away that other person's benefit without their permission. That's what Exodus 21 is saying. I can't just withhold this from you because I want to, or I have a different agenda than you. Because the whole point of the commandment is to ensure that you're oriented toward that other person's happiness, pleasure, and satisfaction. And in doing so, it's going to be reciprocated. So when we think of whether something is merely physical or whether it's spiritual, when we think of the onah as cohabitation, then we have to think of it as mutually beneficial. Because if we just say something like sex, that's something that's carnal. That's something that a beast can do. Something that the beast does. It just procreates. But it's not about deepening in a relationship. It's only going to fulfill the animal drive. That's all it's ever going to do. But in terms of human beings, we are made in the image of Elohim, who is a spiritual being. So if we engage it only at the level of the physical, then most likely one of us is not going to be happy. In other words, part of that commandment is going to be reduced or taken away from us. And if we accept that it's more than physical, that it's also spiritual, at the end of the day, or at the end of the onah, both parties should be feeling a mutual benefit. It shouldn't be one-sided. You know, it's like we say, Shabbat is considered a special day for women. Women are honored especially on Shabbat. It's a special time, just like the onah is her special time primarily. Even though in the Brit Chadashah we can see that it's reciprocal. It extends to both. But a wife's well-being, her emotional well-being, her physical well-being, those things, they are tended to in an especially wonderful way on Shabbat within the Jewish tradition, understanding how foundational that is, not just to the marriage, but to the entire family. And so, as we look at those steps, we have to recognize that in a Jewish marriage, there is no step taken to which she does not consent. In other words, it's not considered valid to proceed in certain parts of betrothal and so forth without the future bride's consent. Every step of the way, from that first betrothal, through that process, through nisuin, through consummation and so forth, every step implies that the bride, especially by sharing the cup ultimately, is giving her consent to that union. And so on Erev Shabbat, on Friday evenings, as we prepare for our Shabbat meal, that's an especially nice time for husbands to work on this spiritual level of the three irreducible obligations. For him to deepen that giving of food, to deepen that covering, to deepen that onah, that period of time, to make it a truly positive expression of holiness. It's special for women, but what is happening is by strengthening her physical and emotional well-being on Erev Shabbat and Shabbat, a great consideration is being given to Shabbat itself. Because remember, it's an application of time. And so that betrothal, the consecration, the special attention given on Shabbat to the wife, it's seen as strengthening not just that family, but those benefits are going to extend to the entire family of faith. It's consecration. What does he say when she takes the cups? With this cup, you are consecrated to me. You are set apart to me, and we're going to be gathered. That our relationship is not going to be conducted merely at a physical level, but at the level of the Spirit. And you can see that. You can see some pictures of this in Revelation. You know, it may be in a future program we can look at the cup, the Kiddush cup, on that level in terms of the marriage. But what we want to do always is to perceive the Spirit. See you next time.